I wanted to thank the organizers, those whose faces and names I do know, and those whose faces and names I don't yet know. This is my first time traveling outside the US since the executive order of January 27th, and its accompanying raids, deportations, mass visa revocations, harassment, arson, attacks on places of worship and cemeteries, and covering them all, fear and anxiety, as we share this mortal and inseparable life on Earth. I wanted to pause and acknowledge this moment, and as the slogan, "No bans on stolen lands," goes, I wanted to dedicate this lecture to the Lakota Water Protectors, Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, and the Oseti-Sakoan Camp. So my project has no head. Pieces, notes, and cells of it are accumulating. And while there are no centers, and I reject the silo of disciplinarity explicitly, there is, I hope, thematic unity. And my approach today is that of three tracings. And echoing what Rosa just said, I want to begin each from direct and personal experience, because I think that's how my insights are formed first and foremost. So I'm going to take the title card and move backwards from the abhuman to the inhuman to the human. Years ago, on a rare visit home, I joined my mother and her friend for tea in my mother's living room. I sat and chatted with them for a while, and eventually my mother's friend got up to get her coat and leave. She re-emerged this time wearing a niqab. I became startled and froze in place. The jarring contrast between the normalcy of an afternoon tea and the sudden appearance of a disappearance, her covered face, threw me into silent paralysis. While it could have scarcely lasted beyond 3 seconds, the effect of it on me was so heavy that once I got over my shame for the terror it invoked, I began to see that there was a face in the first place. This panic of unrecognizability led me to consider the face through the covered face. With masks before faces, with specters and phantoms before characters, the whole apparatus of repetition as a terrible power. Deleuze distinguished a theater of repetition from a theater of representation in which the mask, not the face, is the surest barcode of our humanness. Concealment cannot be reconciled with representation, the dominant sensibility of the West. It can only be repeated. I'm going to look at one particular modern ideology regarding the denial of full personhood. In France, the ban on face covering was instituted in spring of 2011. When I read that the most common slur to demonize the Muslim woman who wears niqab is Belphegor, after the horror demon character that haunts the Louvre Museum in Paris, covering his hideous features with a mask, I decided to follow it to a deeper and narrower tracing. Belphegor, or Baal Peor in ancient Assyrian and later Deuteronomy in the Bible, was a godlike figure associated with licentiousness and orgies, and later medieval demonologists applied the name to the devil. In Jewish mysticism, Belphegor is one of the impure spiritual or demonic forces called klipot, literally husk or shell. De Plancy's Dictionnaire Infernal pictures him as hell's ambassador to France, and he also makes an appearance in Milton's Paradise Lost. Contemporary appearances of Belphegor in French popular culture include serialized comics and a Vogue Paris editorial, notably without its demonizing connotation. But deeper cultural origins land on the influential television series Belphegor, The Phantom of the Louvre. Created in 1965, it was based on the 1927 horror novel by Arthur Berned. It attracted 10 million spectators per episode, which was a very sizable portion of the French population. And it's my contention that the pejorative use of the term in the 90s arose out of a visual mnemonic from this TV series in the 60s. And as the poster on the right shows, there was a major remake in 2001. So I'm going to play one clip from each film, and before I do, I just want to note that there are no subtitles, and I don't think that we need them necessarily.
Enfin, je te tiens, belle figure. Les mains en l'air. Je te préviens que j'hésiterai pas à tirer. Tu ne veux pas? Parfait. Une fois. Deux fois. Tu as bien réfléchi. Trois fois.
And this is the 2001 version.
C'est une blague. Ça va pas recommencer, non?
Vous croyez me faire peur, Verlac? Je suis sûr que c'est vous! Non mais, à votre âge, vous déguisez. Non mais c'est grotesque, hein? C'est minable! Ça pour m'obliger à... Non! Non! C'est ça! Non! Pas le belle, pas le fantôme, non! Vous aviez raison. Il existe.
Thank you. In each, Belphegor, the dieu barbare or Berber god, is framed as an occult appearance, attacking, though not actually harming, the commissaire or police chief, obsessed with capturing him. The play of light and darkness and nocturnal or strobing shots recall the Mosaic tradition of demonic forces who receive no godly emanations or vitalizing sun. Belphegor evades capture, and in his wake we hear Le fantôme s'était échappé, the ghost has escaped. Escape shares its etymology in French with cape from the Latin capa or cloak. To be in a state of coveredness is coterminous with covertness, slippery, evasive, territorially unsecure. And in the 2001 version, the soundtrack of the narration policier, or the whodunit detective story, is replaced with a non-specific Arab New Age music. While bodies were unstable and subject to mutability and confusion in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, they became more hardened in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. This hardening has been referred to as the abhuman, coined by Kelly Hurley in The Gothic Body, after Julia Kristeva's abjection. The prefix ab signals a movement away from a site or condition, and thus a loss. But a movement away from is also a movement towards a site or condition as yet unspecified, and thus entails both a promise, both a threat and a promise. In Old Europe, Belphegor was a repressed sediment of colonial guilt and fear of the indigenous people returning, both temporally and spatially, to claim the priceless antiquities that are rightfully theirs, yet stored and openly displayed at the Louvre. In New Europe, the covered face or visible Muslim presence is viewed as not merely an obstacle to interiority or normative femininity, but as an abhuman presence, the ultimate barrier to European unification. For the sake of time, I won't get into it today, but elsewhere in an essay called Transcript on a Face, I expounded on the abhuman in the grand jury investigation into Mike Brown's face, which Darren Wilson, the officer who killed him, describes as a demon. The first facial recognition technology was created by BlazeVOX in 1965, the same year as the BlazeVOX TV series in France. Facial detection is in frequent use in consumer-grade cameras, and that little green box in all of our smartphones equipped with facial detection performs much better than facial recognition. At a symposium on facial recognition technologies at the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C., I got to watch a technology demonstration by the Intel Corporation. Intel said its facial recognition system, or FRS, could reveal the gender of the person it detected with an astonishing 94% accuracy. So if an advertiser could use the technology, a male-targeted ad could be selected for a male-identified object, such as a BMW. Their words. A feminine-appearing woman and a masculine-appearing man were selected from our audience. The machine read their faces and, within 30 seconds, reported back. The woman with long hair was, unfortunately for Intel, identified as male. This misgendering was an accidental false positive, or glitch, and came to signify an extremely useful way for me to understand the work of the Inhuman. It is not that the face itself becomes inhuman when turned from noise to signal to algorithmic code. The inhumanity is the failure of the truth-telling device itself, and I come to define the Inhuman as the place where the object is revealed, rightly or wrongly, while the revealing subject remains covered. Our environment is equipped to survey us in what technologists call affective interfaces. Billboards with face processing capabilities, such as the BMW ad, promise to environmentally tailor what we are shown based on who the algorithm thinks we are. It is an aggregate and a cumulative form, however, where the environmental threat lies. FRSs do not require our active cooperation, and we soon forget them, or as in this recorded forum, they become a part of our permanent record. Much more than the invisible handprints, we everywhere leave face prints. We edge closer and closer to the asymptotic limit of where online and offline information about us lurks. If we are unmasked at a pharmacy or at a political protest, there is a record of our face, an aggregate of FRSs, and the will of an entity who stays hidden from us simply has to say, "Show me all of the pictures of Mona Lisa." Following the London riots, it was the police who could don a combat niqab, while Google group members used facial recognition to identify protesters in the first major use of aggregate identification to date. In the analog world, this inhumanity has long been with us in the image of the executioner who covers his face, or in the suspension of outright execution, covers all traces of the event itself, erasing flight records, destination, detainee name. Zoom out from this photograph of Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil, and a different picture emerges as the interrogation panel of judges surrounding her hide their faces while her face is revealed, like a visible biometric monitor, the facelessness of bureaucrats, the law, etc., etc. The next frontier of facial detection is demographics and emotions, the possibility of detecting emotional states. Where the detection of emotional states and vehicles of truth-telling have paired well in sensible form is the cinema. In Bela Balázs's essay, The Face of Man, he remarks on the psychological effect of facial expression, particularly in cinema, which can show even microphysiognomic details, his quote, where certain regions of the face scarcely or not at all under voluntary control may betray emotions appearing on the rest of the face. The close-up is a paradox of revealing and concealing. Importantly, such a technique is thought to get at a truth about human behavior, intention, or interiority. One of the most pensive lines of Balázs's essay reads, quote, "We cannot use glycerine tears in a close-up. The actor's tears in such a shot move us because they cannot be faked," he contends. Close-ups make subjective faces objective, a fascinating dichotomy to current biometric databases about face printing, face tagging, among others, where the face becomes a repeatable algorithmic code. In fact, Balázs's comparisons between signs of the face and the hands as conduits to truth-telling are prescient. He viewed decoding the faces of silent cinema akin to graphology, the claim to reading, quote, the writer's true character from handwriting, even if what is written down is untruth. Reading the minuscule variations in the physiognomy of faces was about to become a very useful property of the masses, thanks to the silent film, end quote. Dreyer's Jeanne d'Arc employed several hundred feet of film showing nothing but big close-ups of faces, Balázs wrote, and presumably not a single glycerine tear was found. The earliest artistic depiction I have found of the covered face is a painting by Timanthes depicting Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia. The original fresco is lost, so this is a Roman copy. In the truth-telling device of the Timanthes painting, where only beauty can be captured by the machine of Greek idealism, grief, seen as ugly, must be hidden. We see the face of Menelaus and Odysseus and Calchas, and of course, Iphigenia herself, and no one has asked about her grief toward her own impending death. Why would a skilled painter like Timanthes cover Agamemnon's face? Lessing's Laocoon attributes this veiling to the Greek civilizational value of only sculpting or painting what is beautiful. It is not merely the grief of the father that is not representable, but non-beauty, the face's contortions in the act of grief. This month, I went to a Buddhist silent meditation retreat and answered an ad for a fellow retreatant in need of a ride. My passenger got in the car, and I didn't get a good look at her. For the 2-hour drive, I kept my gaze mostly forward and had only an inkling of what she looked like. While we discussed our motivations for the retreat, she revealed that she had Bell's palsy, a rare condition of facial paralysis that causes muscles to weaken or droop on one half of the face. After a bout of severe stress in grad school, she had awakened to find half her face paralyzed overnight. The shock of it had been great, but much worse was the realization of how the world would now see her, unbeautiful, unnormal, unsightly. It was in the mourning period that followed that she came to acknowledge how deeply she had identified with her face, with attachment that she now called extreme, and an awareness of her own identity that she now deemed false. She made peace with her state through a process of disidentification and detachment in which the face is not a truth teller, but an object among other objects, sound in particular. Like if your body makes a sound, you don't identify with the sound or become the sound. Her insight parallels neuroscience research on human infants who mimic adults in movement before they can visualize themselves or see their own face. In other words, the face begins as a muscular and corporal entity. It belongs to the body at our emergence into the world before its quantifiable, qualifiable, and codifiable destiny. Where do these tracings leave us? I don't want to scatter them like loose, unbounded threads, nor merge them into a convenient universalism, but instead locate them into an urgent and contingent proposal that the face is neither covered nor uncovered, masked or unmasked, but that it is not us. At least it may be of us for those few lucky enough to merge their being with their face. The face is not covered or uncovered. It is its own mask unless and until we contend with our being as the real us and the face a possible planet within the galaxy of being. I want to conclude with this passage from the only novel written by Rilke, The Notebooks of Malte Loritz Brügge. The passage is rather long, but I think it's important to see, especially in light of today, where we stand in shelter together, how the face emerges from noise, then silence. So this scene takes place on September 11th, as Malte watches a pregnant woman fall and lose her face. To think that I can't give up the habit of sleeping with the window open. Electric trolleys speed clattering through my room. Cars drive over me. A door slams. Somewhere a window pane shatters on the pavement. I can hear its large fragments laugh and its small one giggle. Then suddenly a dull, muffled noise from the other direction inside the house. Someone is walking up the stairs, is approaching, ceaselessly approaching, is there for a long time, then passes on. And again, the street. A girl screams, "Ah, tais-toi, je ne veux plus." The trolley races up excitedly, passes on over it, over everything. Someone calls out. People are running, catch up with each other. A dog barks. What a relief, a dog. Toward morning, there's even a rooster crowing, and that is an infinite pleasure. Then I suddenly fall asleep. These are the noises, but there's something here that is more dreadful, the silence. I imagine that during great fires, such a moment of extreme tension must sometimes occur. The jets of water fall back, the firemen stop climbing the ladders, no one moves. Soundlessly, a black cornice pushes forward overhead, and a high wall, with flames shooting up behind it, leans forward soundlessly. Everyone stands and waits, with raised shoulders and faces contracted above their eyes for the terrifying crash. The silence here is like that. Have I said it before? I'm learning to see. Yes, I am beginning. It's still going badly. But I intend to make the most of my time. For example, it never occurred to me before how many faces there are. There are multitudes of people, but there are many more faces because each person has several of them. There are people who wear the same face for years. Naturally, it wears out, gets dirty, splits at the seams, stretches like gloves worn during a long journey. They are thrifty, uncomplicated people. They never change it, never even have it cleaned. It's good enough, they say, and who can convince them of the contrary? Of course, since they have several faces, you might wonder what they do with the other ones. They keep them in storage. Their children will wear them. But sometimes it also happens that their dogs go out wearing them. And why not? A face is a face. Other people change faces incredibly fast, put on one after another, and wear them out. At first, they think they have an unlimited supply, but when they're barely 40 years old, they come to their last one. There is, to be sure, something tragic about this. They are not accustomed to taking care of faces. Their last one is worn through in a week, has holes in it, is in many places as thin as paper, and then, little by little, the lining shows through the non-face, and they walk around with that one. The street was too empty. Its emptiness had gotten bored and pulled my steps out from under my feet and clattered around in them all over the street as if they were wooden clogs. The woman sat up, frightened. She pulled out of herself too quickly, too violently, so that her face was left in her two hands. I could see it lying there, its hollow form. It cost me an indescribable effort to stay with those two hands, not to look at what had been torn out of them. I shuddered to see a face from the inside, but I was much more afraid of that bare, flayed head waiting there, faceless. Thank you.
Monalisa. Thank you, Monalisa. I had one question prepared that maybe is not very much on this, but I wanted to hear your perspective about what is happening in Europe, since we've heard you talk about your own environment, and I'm curious how it translates the changes in how we have to behave with our faces here in Europe, and how that even translates to your continent, if you hear about this. And by the way, we also, if there's a question from the audience, we have a very little time, but if so, I'm gonna look around while you're answering.
Thanks for that question. I remember at the Intel demonstration I mentioned, There were also companies like Facebook and Google there, and this is a few years ago, this is 2001. And some of them were there to literally sell products, at least politically, through the Federal Trade Commission. But there were also a lot of privacy activists, and one of the notes I remember making on the corner of my pad was a privacy activist saying, invest in masks. And I think by now, that's something that we just sort of take for granted in terms of masks at political protests, or we're quite aware, I think, of the fact of being seen, of our openness. But I think that in truth, and this is for Europe and elsewhere, and I actually, when I say the West, I say it almost generically and include, you know, the Middle East as well, Latin America as well. The covered face is the site of extreme suspicion. And so I imagine that with the same feeling of terror I had seeing my mother's friend wear niqab, I might feel and embody and incorporate some of that terror in myself if I were to very self-consciously cover my face in any context. As you mentioned, the laws in Netherlands or in Sao Paulo where helmets, ocultia face as it's called, covering the face, are forbidden. New York State famously has a law on the books since 1865 that groups in 3 or more cannot have their faces covered, and actually it has a very long standing history that goes back to Native Americans covering their face as their lands were taken and as they were evacuated from their lands, and their response back to the sheriffs of the town. So this history is quite long-standing, and I think gets culturally inflected with the presence of each new political enemy. So I think there's a continuity there. Obviously, as those of you in the Netherlands, especially in the audience, will probably have much more of a sense of site specificity than I do. And but I think the site of that suspicion is still with us and will be with us for a long time.
Thank you. Were there any questions from the audience? I didn't see any hands coming up. No, okay. Yes.
I just had a nice, if you walk around, what is of course interesting is, Teresa, who did all the design, she of course worked on this idea of, in this more and more digital world, how easy it becomes to modulate ourselves. So on the one hand, of course, in public life or out on the streets, covering is an analog act. But I think at the same time, so I was wondering also how you see that transition, because of course the face is a very present thing, but how do you see that in a more digital sense? The hiding also becomes easier once things are mediated, not?
You're saying that in the digital realm, hiding the face specifically becomes easier?
Well, since more and more is going back and forth between, with machines in between us, there is so much modulation we can do ourselves. So this idea of the face also becomes something that you're more and more in control of at the same time as that it is taken from you.
I think I agree with that. I think more and more I'm trying to see where there is a collapse or glitch, as I was saying before, a suture, a gap between the online and the offline. And without taking too much of a position on it, I think it's within that gap that there's a lot of possibility. So of course we can invest in masks, we can put our head down, we can cover half of our face. There's other things we can do in the online. In the offline, we maybe have the actual or the illusion of greater control. I know that I never even made photos of myself available for platforms such as this until very, very recently. I think this is actually the first one, ironically, that I've even made a photo of myself available. I I think, I don't know if that's so much about like relinquishing and giving in. But perhaps I think what I find so vacant sometimes about a purely technological or technologist-driven argument about faces and coverings is that much deeper tracing, and probably in directions much further out than the 3 I had time to cover today. But that there is a face to, in the first place, whether captured by the truth-telling device or not, is, I think, something I want to press onward with, and still have us, you know, in this present moment, actually look for those gaps and sutures, whether or not we submit author and artist photos or put our faces down or otherwise. But just being aware and perhaps disidentifying and detaching. You know, faces are really strange objects. I don't wish to sort of say like, let's just, you know, get rid of the idea. They're unlike other prints in our lives, they can very rarely or scarcely be changed. But I want to urge us to look beyond a purely technologist driven argument, if that makes sense.
Yes, very much. I saw a question here in the second row.
Thank you for the talk, Monalisa. I just wondered whether you could say a few words about the gender implications of in particular, the Belphegor character, and also, obviously, so much of the kind of public discourse has circulated around women, with the woman who was arrested in Toulouse by the mayor wearing a burkini on the beach, which is a little bit of a different argument, I realize, but maybe if you could say a few words about your thinking in relationship to the specific inscription of the feminine into this character.
Yeah, thanks for that question. One of the directions I couldn't really move into, which a separate photo essay hopes to move into, is the sartorial uses of the face. So one of the things I'm looking at is how, particularly in France, but let me just say France as a stand-in for other territories, fashion is a particular sacred space. So where there is this sort of particularized ban on face coverings that have to do with religious uses, so particular to Muslim women or some small segments of Muslim women, there is this sort of like sacred space of fashion. And I wish I could have talked about that a little bit more, but I trace that history back to colonial Maghreb, where the French Pieds Noirs encounter Muslim women often covering their faces and having a quite separated public and private life, right? Where the bodily separation and the private separation are coterminous. And then from there, in their postcards back home, this is in Malik Alula's colonial harem, where he collects the postcards, the French colonialists pose and bear the women with naked breasts and faces covered. So there's this, I don't particularly like the word fetish, but there is a stigmatized or fetishized covering and revealing. And there's that aspect of the feminization and, as you say, the gendered uses. But I never want to sort of, when we say gender, I think it's a shorthand for women. And there's no such thing. I think thinking about the way the face has been, the face covering has been imposed in places like Guantanamo, which is populated by 100% Muslim men. And other things I can't show you, like the fiche d'interrogation, the leaked interrogation manuals from the French police showing the torture of Muslim detainees within France, is also about taking away sight, hearing, and other demasculinizations of the subject. So the way this has worked, again, I think I want us to urge us to look into historical and other tracings.
Thank you very much. We have to continue with the next presentation. Thanks.